The wrench slipped from Danny Kowalski's hand and clattered across the concrete floor, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on what was happening 12 feet away, on the other side of the gas station window, out in the parking lot of the Sunrise Diner next door. Commissioner Gerald Pratt had just shoved a young woman hard enough to send her stumbling back into a pickup truck. Danny set down the socket wrench slowly. His jaw tightened. The woman was Leah Torres. 24 years old, worked the morning shift at Sunrise 6 days a week. Danny knew her the way you know people in a town like Millhaven, Missouri. Not close, but enough. She'd brought him coffee once when his garage heater died in January. Good kid, worked hard, kept to herself. Pratt was 53, three-term county commissioner, and the kind of man who wore his authority the way other men wear cologne, heavy and everywhere. He had his finger in Leah's face now. His town car idled at the curb, driver waiting, like this was just a stop on his schedule. Danny couldn't hear the words through the glass, but he could read the shape of them just fine. He'd grown up in Millhaven. He knew what Gerald Pratt looked like when he was reminding someone of their place. The trouble had started 3 weeks earlier, though Leah wouldn't have been able to pinpoint the exact moment it began. That's how it goes with men like Pratt. It starts small. A comment, a hand that lingers. A look that says, I could make things difficult for you. Leah had been at Sunrise for 2 years. The job wasn't glamorous. Grease-stained aprons, 6 a.m. Starts, feet that ached by noon, but it paid steady, and the owner, a soft-spoken woman named June Hargrove, treated her people right. Leah was saving up. She had plans. Community college in the fall, maybe nursing. She had a folder on her phone with financial aid information she read on her lunch breaks. Pratt started coming in every Tuesday. Always sat in her section. Always left a $50 bill under his coffee cup and always made sure she saw him leave it. The first time, she'd thanked him the way you thank anyone. Professional, warm, brief. He'd touched her wrist when she cleared his plate, just lightly. You're wasted here, he said. Smart girl like you. She'd smiled and moved on to the next table. By the third Tuesday, he was asking about her schedule. By the fifth, he'd started calling her sweetheart in a tone that made the word feel like a lock turning. She told June. June went pale and told her to be careful and looked out the window for a long moment before she said anything else. Gerald Pratt owns the building this diner's in, she finally said. He's on the zoning board. He's on the liquor license board. She looked at Leah the way a woman looks at someone younger who hasn't yet learned how gravity works. I'm not saying don't stand up for yourself. I'm saying know what you're standing in. Leah understood. She started finding reasons to let the other girls take his table. Pratt noticed. That was the Tuesday he followed her to the parking lot. Danny Kowalski had run the garage since he was 26. Millhaven Automotive. He'd bought it with borrowed money and 3 years of savings from working at a dealership in Jefferson City, and he'd built it up the old-fashioned way, word of mouth, honest work, fair prices. He was 31 now, and the business was his whole life, for better or worse. No family in town anymore, father gone. Mother in Tucson with her sister. He was the kind of man who didn't say much until he had something to say. He watched through the window as Pratt grabbed Leah's arm. She yanked it back. Pratt stepped closer, close enough that she had to press against the truck behind her, just to keep distance between them. Danny was already walking out the side door. He came around the corner of the building at a normal pace, nothing aggressive, hands loose at his sides. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a grease burn on the sleeve and steel-toed boots, and he hadn't shaved in 4 days. He was not a small man. He stopped 6 feet from Pratt. Morning. Pratt turned. He had the look of a man who had never once been interrupted and wasn't sure what to do with the sensation. Excuse me, she okay? Danny addressed the question to Leah. Leah's eyes went to Pratt, then back to Danny. Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief, not yet. More like the moment before you decide whether to trust a bridge with your weight. She's fine, Pratt said. Mind your business. Danny didn't look at him. Leah, you okay? She stopped, started again. I'd like to go back inside. Sure, Danny said. He didn't move to let her pass Pratt. He just stood there, looking at the commissioner with the same calm expression he used when he was explaining to a customer why their transmission was shot. Pratt stepped back, barely, but he stepped back. Leah walked past him and through the diner door without looking back. Pratt stared at Danny for a long moment. You have any idea who I am? Gerald Pratt, Danny said. County commissioner. You own the building. Something flickered in Pratt's eyes. Calculation, not quite anger. Smart man, he said. Then he straightened his jacket, got back into his town car, and left. Danny stood in the parking lot until the car was out of sight. Then he went back to the garage and picked up his wrench. He didn't feel like he'd done anything special. He'd just been there. That, as it would turn out, was the part that mattered. He didn't see Leah again for 4 days. On a Friday afternoon, she came into the garage, not in her uniform, wearing jeans and a denim jacket, and asked if he had a minute. He waved her toward the office, really just a desk behind a glass partition, cluttered with invoices and empty coffee cups. And she sat down in the old rolling chair and folded her hands in her lap. She told him the whole thing, methodically, like she'd been rehearsing the order of it. Pratt's escalating attention, June's warning the parking lot, and then what happened after. What happened after was that 2 of Pratt's people had come to the diner Wednesday morning. Not deputies, not official, Just men in plain clothes who sat at the counter and didn't order much and watched the room. June had asked them to leave after an hour and they'd gone without a word. Then the health inspector showed up Thursday. First inspection in 2 years. He'd cited the diner for 3 minor violations. Nothing that would close them down, but enough to cost June money and time and worry she didn't have. She thinks it's connected, Leah said. Danny leaned back in his chair. Is it? I think so. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of his guys was running an engine. The familiar rhythm of it was steadying. What do you want to do? Leah looked at him straight. I want to stop being scared of him. Danny nodded slowly. Okay, he didn't say more than that. But it was the kind of okay that meant he'd thought about it and landed somewhere solid. Leah could hear the difference. What Leah didn't know, what most people in Millhaven didn't know, was that Danny Kowalski had a history with Gerald Pratt that predated all of this. 7 years ago, Danny's father, Ed Kowalski, had owned a tire shop on Route 9. A good business. 20 years of operation. Pratt had wanted the property for a strip mall development. Ed had said no. 6 months later, the zoning board, Pratt's board, had reclassified the land and condemned the building on a building code issue that had been fabricated from scratch. Ed had fought it, lost, died of a heart attack 14 months later, which his doctor said had nothing to do with the stress of it, though Danny had his own thoughts on that. Danny had never confronted Pratt, never spoken about it publicly. He'd just moved 2 blocks away, bought the garage, and built something of his own. He'd kept his distance from anything that touched Pratt's orbit. He kept that distance because he was a man who thought in long time frames. He believed in a quiet but unshakable way that what goes around eventually comes around, but only if someone keeps the wheel turning. He'd been waiting, without entirely knowing he was waiting, for the right moment to push. The man who would change everything arrived on a Sunday. He came in on a Harley Road Glide, gunmetal gray, the kind of bike that meant the rider had been riding long enough to stop caring about anything that wasn't engineered to last. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with a gray-streaked beard and hands that looked like they'd done serious work for serious years. His cut, the sleeveless leather vest, said Iron Vanguard MC across the back, with a patch below that read Sergeant-at-Arms. His name was Boyd Calloway, and he was not someone you could place easily in a category. He'd spent 12 years as a heavy equipment operator before the union collapsed. He'd spent 3 more driving long haul. He'd landed in the Iron Vanguard in his mid-30s and risen through it not by violence but by being the most reliably competent man in any room. He had a code that was stricter than most law-abiding men's, even if it operated outside the law's framework. He came in because his Road Glide had a front brake issue he didn't like the feel of. Danny spent an hour on it, found a hairline fracture in the caliper bracket, replaced it, and charged him cost plus 15 minutes of labor. Boyd watched the whole thing from a stool near the lift. You don't upsell, Boyd said when Danny handed him the invoice. What would I upsell you on? Most shops would have said you need new pads, new rotors, full fluid flush. You've got maybe 8,000 miles on those pads. Fluid's fine. Rotors are fine. Boyd looked at the invoice for a moment. Good to know a man still exists who does that. They shook hands. Boyd left. He came back 2 days later with 3 other Iron Vanguard members who all needed various work done. He sat in the same spot and drank 2 cups of coffee, and at some point, in the way that conversations sometimes shift without any deliberate pivot, he asked Danny what was going on with the diner next door. Danny looked at him. Boyd lifted a hand. I saw the whole parking lot situation Monday morning. I was fueling up across the street. He let that sit. You stepped in, didn't feel like a choice, Danny said. Boyd considered that for a moment, like he was weighing the word choice against something heavier. Who is he? Danny told him. Not everything, just enough. Pratt, the county commissioner, the diner, the health inspection, the men who came and sat and watched. Boyd was quiet for a long time. Then, the girl's still working there? Far as I know. And he hasn't come back directly? Not that I know of. He's being patient, Boyd said, more to himself than to Danny. Men like that are always patient. They wait until you think it's over. Danny knew that was true. He'd seen it with his father. What's your stake in this? Boyd asked. It was a fair question. Danny thought about it honestly before answering. She doesn't have anyone to stand in front of her, he said. And someone should. Boyd nodded once, like that settled something. He finished his coffee and stood up. I know some people, he said. People who've dealt with men like Pratt before, not the kind of people who file paperwork. He paused. But sometimes the paperwork follows. What Boyd Calloway had, among other things, was a contact in the state attorney general's office. A former Vanguard member's brother. A man named Dennis Ray who'd become a prosecutor and never forgotten where he grew up, or who'd looked out for his family when their landlord tried to have them evicted during a hard year. Dennis didn't owe the Vanguard anything improper, but he paid attention when Boyd Calloway called. Boyd called on a Wednesday evening. He didn't ask for anything specific. He just asked Dennis if the name Gerald Pratt meant anything. It meant something. Pratt had been flagged twice in the past 5 years. Once in a civil complaint from a building contractor who said Pratt had killed a permit approval to force a lower bid. Once in a complaint from a former county employee who said she'd been pressured out of her job after rebuffing him. Neither complaint had gone anywhere. The contractor dropped his case. The employee moved out of state. Dennis told Boyd this was a pattern. And patterns, he said, were exactly what the AG's office needed before they could move. I might have some fresh material, Boyd said. He drove back to Millhaven Thursday morning and met with Leah Torres in the parking lot of Millhaven Automotive, with Danny leaning against the garage door 12 feet away, close enough to be present, far enough to give her space. Boyd introduced himself plainly, without theater. He told her what he knew. He told her what he didn't know. He told her she didn't have to do anything she didn't want to do, and that he would not be back if she said no. Leah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Danny. Danny said nothing. It wasn't his call. He just held her gaze until she looked back at Boyd and said, "What do you need from me?" What they needed was documentation. Leah had kept, without knowing she was keeping evidence, a running record of Pratt's behavior. Texts he'd sent to her personal number, a voicemail she'd saved without knowing why, a photograph one of the other waitresses had taken on a phone when Pratt had cornered Leah near the register, and the girl had thought, without knowing what she was looking at, that something was wrong. June Hargrove had the health inspector's report. She also had, it turned out, her own records, a log she'd been keeping since the men in plain clothes sat at her counter, the same way she logged invoices and inventory, because June Hargrove was a woman who believed in writing things down. The contractor, the one who dropped his case 2 years ago, had not destroyed his documentation. He was a man named Paul Shelton who ran a small framing crew out of Rolla, and when Boyd Calloway drove out to see him in person, Paul looked at him for a long moment and said, "I was wondering if anyone would ever come back around to this." His records were detailed. Dates, dollar amounts, the specific permit numbers that had been held. He had emails. He had a voice recording from a meeting in which a Pratt associate had been explicit about what it would take to get things moving. Dennis Ray drove down from Jefferson City on a Friday with a colleague from the AG's office. They met with Leah, with June, with Paul Shelton, separately, in Danny's garage after hours with the overhead lights on and the bay doors shut. They took statements. They photographed documents. They stayed until almost midnight. Before Dennis left, he shook Danny's hand. "You run a good shop," he said, and the way he said it meant more than the words. Pratt made his next move on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the parking lot incident, which Boyd had correctly predicted. He came himself this time, which was a mistake born of impatience. He'd been waiting for the situation to resolve itself, for Leah to be worn down or for Danny to realize the cost of involvement, and neither had happened. So he came in person. He walked into the Sunrise Diner at 7:45 a.m. on a Saturday, when it was busy, when there were people in every booth, when the noise of the place gave him the cover of normalcy. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee he didn't drink. And when Leah came around with the pot, he said quietly, in a tone calibrated to go no further than her ears, that this had gone on long enough and that she should consider whether her job, her boss's lease, and her community college applications were worth the trouble she was creating. He knew about the applications. That was the point. That was him demonstrating reach. Leah set the coffee pot down on the counter without pouring. She looked at Pratt for a moment that seemed to stretch well past its actual length. Then she said, "I need you to say that again." Pratt frowned. "Excuse me?" From her apron pocket, Leah Torres produced a phone. On the screen was a recording application, timer running, the red dot solid. She'd been recording since she saw his town car pull into the lot. Pratt stood up from the stool so fast it scraped back on the floor. Every head in the diner turned. In the corner booth, Boyd Calloway and 2 Iron Vanguard members set down their menus. By the register, June Hargrove looked up. At the window seat, an older man named Warren Gould, who'd worked for the county assessor's office for 30 years and had his own reasons for disliking Gerald Pratt, watched with the quiet attention of a man who knows a decisive moment when he sees one. "That's Pratt, stop." "That's what?" Leah said. Her voice was level. Her hands were steady. The diner was completely silent now. Pratt looked around the room. He counted faces. He performed the calculation that men like him have always performed and arrived, for the first time in a very long time, at the wrong answer. He left without his jacket. The recording went to Dennis Ray by noon. The formal investigation was announced 6 weeks later. The AG's office filed charges in 3 categories: abuse of public office, criminal coercion, and civil rights violations in the contractor case. A 4th charge, related to the fabricated building code issue that had cost Ed Kowalski his property, was added after Dennis Ray spent an afternoon going through 7-year-old zoning records that had been subpoenaed as part of the broader case. Danny heard about that 4th charge from Dennis personally, on a phone call he hadn't expected. He sat in his office for a long time after he hung up. The garage was quiet. It was almost 6 o'clock and his guys had gone home. Outside, the last light was going orange over the parking lot. He thought about his father, not the end of it, the shop, the condemnation notice, the heart attack. He thought about earlier, about Ed Kowalski on a Sunday afternoon, bent over an engine, teaching Danny how to read a torque spec. About the way his father had always said that the work itself was the point, that if you did good work, it had a way of stacking up. He hadn't understood that as fully then as he did now. Pratt was suspended from the commissioner's seat pending trial. He did not resign. because men like Pratt don't resign, they make you take the thing from them. But the suspension held, backed by a county board vote that went 5-1, the one dissenter being a man who owned property adjacent to two of Pratt's developments, and who would, within a year, be the subject of his own inquiry. The health violations against Sunrise Diner were reviewed and formally rescinded. June Hargrove received a written apology from the county health department that she framed and hung in the kitchen, which she said was partly ironic and partly because she never wanted to forget that it had happened. Paul Shelton's contracting business picked up considerably in the months that followed, partly because the permit that had been blocked was finally issued, and partly because in a town like Millhaven, people talk, and what they were talking about was a framing crew whose owner had held onto his records for 2 years waiting for someone to come ask. Leah Torres enrolled in the nursing program at State Technical College of Missouri in the fall. She kept her shifts at Sunrise through December because she wanted to, and because she and June had the kind of relationship that didn't end just because circumstances changed. On her last shift, Danny came in for breakfast, which he almost never did. He ordered eggs and black coffee and left a tip that was more than the bill, which made Leah roll her eyes at him in a way that meant she appreciated it. They didn't make a production of the goodbye. That wasn't their way. Boyd Calloway came back through Millhaven the following April, heading south toward Arkansas on a long run with 4 other Iron Vanguard members. He stopped at the garage for a fluid check and a cup of coffee, the same as before. Danny looked at the road glide. Everything was solid. He told Boyd so. Boyd paid, finished his coffee standing up and said, "You heard about the 4th charge?" "Dennis called me." Boyd nodded. He looked out at the street for a moment. "Your old man have a name for the shop?" "Kowalski Tire and Auto. Good name." Boyd set down his coffee cup. "Worth remembering." He pulled on his gloves, walked out to the road glide, started it with the ease of long habit, and rode south without looking back. Danny stood in the bay door and watched him go, the sound of the engine fading out into the flat Missouri morning, and then he turned back to the work. There was always more work. That was the good part. He picked up a wrench and got back to it.